Chapter 6, The Visual Arts. The previous chapter, the first on a specific art form, was devoted to music, since this has often been thought to be art at its purest. But it is a notable fact that the word art is most naturally associated with the visual arts and painting in particular. E.H. Gombrich's The Story of Art, which has sold millions of copies and gone into 16 editions, is really the story of painting, with some references to sculpture and architecture. Neither music nor poetry makes any appearance in it. This tendency to identify art in general with the visual arts both arises from and lends support to a very ancient view of art as mimesis, Greek for copying or imitation. Art on this view is the replication of things in nature that are especially beautiful or in some other way worth contemplating. Such a conception, as we saw in the previous chapter, has a difficulty over music, where the idea of representation is problematic, but it fits the visual arts very easily, and it is for this reason that representationalism, the view that representation is one of the chief function of art, is so often applied to painting. In its commonest version, representationalism is a normative view, a view about good and bad in art. It leads people to place a high value on very lifelike portraits, such as those by the great masters, Michelangelo, Rubens, Velázquez, and so on, and to raise questions about the value of modern art, the cubist distortions of Picasso, the surrealist figures of Jean Miro, the abstracts of Kandinsky, or the action paintings of Jackson Pollock. Though 20th century art has become familiar to a large proportion of the general public, the belief persists that there is some important connection between lifelike representation and artistic value. This is partly because the historical development of painting was closely identified with gradual mastery of better and better methods of representation. But representationalism is also a view that some of the great artists themselves have endorsed. The important French sculptor and graphic artist Auguste Rodin, 1840 to 1917, famous for the statue The Thinker, is recorded as saying The only principle in art is to copy what you see. Dealers in aesthetics to the contrary. Every other method is fatal. Representationalism has also found support among philosophers of art. Aristotle makes the activity of representing things the distinguishing character of what we now call the arts. Plato decried art precisely because he thought it did no more than reproduce the appearance of things. Representationalism, then, is a widespread view that, with a long history and important credentials in both art and philosophy, yet, as we shall see, representationalism is false as a descriptive theory, even in the case of the visual arts. And while representation is clearly important in painting, it does not adequately explain its value. At the same time, it is a view well worth examining, because it is only once we have seen the errors in representationalism that we will fully appreciate the sort of value visual art can have. What is representation? Ideas about good and bad painting are often uncertain because of a tendency to confuse representation with copying. While people praise and admire lifelike portraiture and landscape painting, they also suppose that artists should not merely copy what they see, but add an element of personal interpretation. It is in this interpretation that many people think the art lies, and which raises it above simple copying. This is partly why they often wonder whether photography, which merely reproduces what is there by causal means, can really be an art. Yet whether photography is an art or not, it does not produce copies of the appearance of things. We never see in sepia or monochrome. When I look at a black and white photograph of a group of people, one of whom has red hair, that person is represented in the picture, but not by a copy of her appearance. Even in a full color photograph, the redness of her hair can be enhanced by filter, exposure, or lighting. Besides, every photograph has an angle from which it is taken. Since there is no neutral position that we can think of as the true angle from which a person or an object has to be seen, the angle is the choice of the photographer. Copying suggests passivity, but perfect passivity in photography is impossible. It is this fact and other similar facts upon which the art of the photographer is built. The same is true of painting. we are inclined to think of representation as copying, partly because the dominant convention in painting has long been to represent via strict resemblance. But this need not be so. Figures in ancient Egyptian art often appear peculiar and somewhat primitive to us, as though the artists were incapable of better. Part of the reason for this, however, is different convention in representation. Ancient Egyptian art operated with the principle that each part of the human anatomy should be represented from the angle at which it is best seen. Thus, while the face was depicted in profile, the torso was depicted from the front, and legs and feet from the side. Taken as a whole, the end result was a body unlike any that has ever been seen. But it would be a mistake to conclude that there was some failure of representation. There was merely a different convention of representation. Ours may seem to us more natural, as perhaps it is, but its naturalness should not deceive us into thinking that it is more representational. Foreshortening, perspective, the use of light and shade, which contribute so significantly to representation in Western art, were all important discoveries that greatly increased the power of the painter. But the power they give to the painter is not to reproduce what is there, but to create a convincing impression that we are seeing the thing represented. The consequence is that even the most lifelike representations cannot be thought of as a mere copies. Their creators follow conventions determining how things are to be represented and employ techniques which oblige us to look at things in certain ways. John Constable, 1776 to 1837, that most natural of painters, whose painting, The Haywain, is one of the best known and best loved pictures in existence, uses blues and greens that are never actually found in sky or foliage. In Gimcrack, George Stubbs, 1724 to 1806, represents the speed of a racing horse very effectively. But movie stills reveal that horses do not actually gallop that way. All the paintings referred to in this chapter can be found in E.H. Gombrich's The Story of Art, 1995. Any depiction of nature that tries just to copy must fail, partly because every copy of nature must involve seeing selectively, and partly because the work must reflect the representational resources available to the painter. The divorce between representation and copying is complete when we turn to a popular area of visual art, cartoons. No mouse has ever looked like Mickey Mouse, and no ancient Gaul ever looked like Asterix. Yet it is obvious, even to small children, what they are. Many famous woodcuts, drawings, and engravings could be cited to sustain the same point. It is simply a mistake to think of representation in the visual arts as simple attempt to copy what is seen. Representation and artistic value. Resembling, copying, and representing are easily confused, but they are quite different. Cartoons can represent without resembling, and pictures can resemble the things they represent without being copies of them. Under the influence of naive representationalism, people sometimes complain that the faces and figures in so-called modern art do not look anything like the real thing. This is probably not a complaint peculiar to the modern period. It seems likely that those brought up on the highly realistic pictures of Dürer, 1471 to 1528, and Holbein, 1497 to 1543, thought something of the same about the rather more extravagant paintings by El Greco, 1541 to 1614. But the important point is that if representation and resemblance are different, the visual arts can abandon resemblance without ceasing to be representational. Might they then go further and abandon representation without ceasing to be art? One reason for thinking so is the fact that some outstanding artists whose skill at representation is unquestionable have abandoned strictly representational painting. In the story of art, Gombrich invites us to compare Picasso's A Hen with Chickens with his slightly earlier picture, A Cockerel. The first of these is a charming illustration for Buffon's natural history, but the second, a rather grotesque caricature. Gombrich makes the point that the first of these pictures amply demonstrates Picasso's ability to make lifelike representations. Consequently, when we note that the second drawing looks nothing like a cockerel, instead of dismissing it, we should ask what Picasso is trying to do with it. According to Gombrich, Picasso was not content with giving a mere rendering of the bird's appearance. He wanted to bring out its aggressiveness, its cheek, and its stupidity. Is another artist illustrative of the same point. In his L.S. Lowry, 1887 to 1976, is another artist illustrative of the same point. In his most famous pictures, people are generally drawn with a childish simplicity, stick figures, in fact, but his early drawings of male nudes show that this manner of depiction was a matter of choice. And we will only appreciate the pictures properly if we look into the reason for that choice. Gombrich's interpretation of the Picasso cartoon brings out an important distinction that representationalism tends to overlook. There is a difference between representing something and giving a rendering of something's appearance. Those who favor representational art usually mean to favor painting that gives a good rendering of the appearance of things. As we have seen, giving a good rendering is not a matter of copying the appearance of things, but creating something that resembles and thereby gives the viewer a convincing impression of having seen the object. Now, what the example of Picasso's Cockerel shows is that the creation of a resemblance is only one purpose for representation. The cartoon does not look like a bird we might see, but it is still representational. What it represents is not the bird's appearance, but its character. This shows that representation can serve purposes other than creating a resemblance. And in turn, this opens up the possibility that these other purposes can be served by means other than representation. Consider some further examples of representation. Almost all the painting from the European Middle Ages is religious in inspiration and purpose. The aim of much of it was to provide the illiterate faithful with instruction in Bible stories, Christian doctrine, and the history of the church, especially the history of its saints and martyrs. It did not aim at mere instruction, however, since it sought also to be inspirational, to prompt in those who looked at it an attitude of mind that would be receptive of divine grace. One interesting example of this is Dürer's engraving, The Nativity. Dürer is a particularly good choice here because his pictures give us such obviously excellent renderings of the appearance of things. The engraving shows a dilapidated farmyard in which Joseph, depicted as an elderly peasant, is drawing water at the well, while in the front left-hand corner, Mary bends over the infant Jesus, much less prominently portrayed. Looking through a rear doorway, in fact, is a kneeling shepherd, accompanied by ox and ass. In the very distant sky, there is a single angel. The difference in scale of these traditional nativity figures relative to the house and farm buildings is striking. But it is also a little misleading. The picture is not any the less a nativity scene than those in which shepherds and angels are more prominent. What Dürer has done by a magnificently detailed representation of a common Northern European farmhouse is to convey very immediately the compelling atmosphere of Holy Night, with the purpose, we may suppose, of inducing a deeper sense of the mystery of the incarnation in the sort of people for whom the picture was intended. Compare Dürer's engraving with Number 1 by Jackson Pollock, 1912 to 1956. This painting is a result of Pollock's celebrated technique, later known as action painting, in which the canvas is placed on the floor and commercial enamels and metallic paints are dripped and splashed on it spontaneously. The outcome is an interesting and unusual pattern which the advocates of action painting thought revealed something of the artist's unconscious. But whether it does or not, the painting itself does not resemble anything. At first sight, these two paintings could hardly be more different. Pollock was intentionally the product of spontaneity and made with some speed. Dürer's the result of hours of painstaking work. Dürer's is a representational to an unusually high degree. Pollock's wholly non-representational. Yet, despite these striking differences, it is not implausible to say that both works share something of the same purpose. Pollock's Number 1 is an example of abstract expressionism, and much of the painting that falls under this label was influenced by Eastern mysticism. Both the spontaneity of production and the random patterns it brings about were thought valuable because they shake ordered preconceptions. We are forced to see visual chaos rather than visual pattern, and thus to see the uncertain, even unreal nature of the world of appearance. Using the visual to create impressions of unreality is similar to the way in which some versions of Buddhism try to shake our preconceptions as a means of spiritual enlightenment. The paintings of abstract expressionism might be thought of as visual equivalents of Zen koans. The questions which the novice is made to contemplate, such as what is the sound of one hand clapping? Of course, the creation and contemplation of Zinga or Zen pictures, for the most part abstract works of calligraphy, are an important part of Zen Buddhist practice also. Interpreted in this way, both Dürer's and Pollock's paintings, despite their striking differences, share the same purpose: to make people aware of spiritual realities behind everyday experience. It is not crucially important here whether the spiritual purpose so described fits either case. These two pictures illustrate the point that, in intention at any rate, representational and non-representational styles of painting, despite their radical differences, are both means that can be employed to the same artistic purpose. What this shows is that we should not think of representation as the sole or even chief end of visual art, but only as one, admittedly very prominent, means. To see this is to reject representation as the criterion by which visual art is to be judged. Since a means is only as valuable as the end it serves, it remains the case, of course, that representation is the stock in trade of visual artists. And nothing in the foregoing argument involves denying this. Even the surrealists, a school of which Salvador Dali, 1904 to 1989, is perhaps the best known member, who rejected the idea of renderings of the appearance of things, still made extensive use of representation. One of its greatest exponents, René Magritte, 1898 to 1967, is a brilliant representational artist, but the things he represents are fantasies. They could not possibly be how actual things appear. We should infer from this that not that most painting is visual representation, but that representation is a highly valuable technique in visual art. Importantly, it is not the only one. There are other techniques to be explored. But to understand the value of visual art, we must go beyond both representation and these other techniques and seek the ultimate purpose they serve. This brings us back to our central question. What is the most valuable end that art can serve? Preceding chapters concluded that neither pleasure nor beauty nor the expression of emotion can adequately fill this role. The answer aesthetic cognitivism gives is enriching human understanding. Can painting do this? And if so, how? Art and the visual. Constable commenting upon a new attraction on view in London denied that it was art since it involved visual deception. And art pleases by reminding, not by deceiving. Quoted in E.H. Gombrich's Art and Illusion, 1977. What this remark reveals is the assumption that the purpose of art is to please. The only question in Constable's mind is in the manner in which it does this. By reminding or deceiving the eye. This assumption is probably widely shared. As we saw in Chapter 1, it sits ill with everyday social practice. Works of imagination are not ranked according to the pleasure they give. The clearest possible examples of drawings, paintings, photographs, and films that are intended to give pleasure and frequently do are pornographic ones. It is hardly these, however, that will be held up to be the principal products of the art world. Of course, it will be said correctly that there are pleasures other than sexual titillation. But this is not to the point. The arguments in Chapter 1 showed that there is no way of distinguishing between pleasures that will allow us to hold both that the value of art lies in the pleasure we get from it, and that there is an evaluative difference between serious and light art. We need not rehearse those arguments to see that they apply with equal force to a particular branch of art, in this case, painting. Someone persuaded by the arguments made in Chapter 1 might nevertheless be reluctant to abandon the idea that the value of visual art, or part of it, is the pleasure it gives, and may maintain that, at least in one respect, the greater the art, the greater the pleasure. This respect is the skill displayed by the artist. The history of Western art from 1400 to 1900 is a story of the discovery of a wide range of techniques in the use of perspective, composition, and color, and of the achievements these made possible. Both the skills of the great painters and the effects they achieved in their paintings are truly astonishing. They are, we might say, a delight to behold, and whether or not we call our delight in them pleasure, the fact remains that it is partly for the pleasure that we value them. Still, even if this is true, it tells only half the story. Human beings have mastered many astonishing techniques. But the question of the value we should attach to those techniques remains unsettled until we know what they can be used to achieve. The Guinness Book of Records lists a large number of achievements made possible only through the mastery of skills which, though rarely mastered because of their difficulty, accomplish largely trivial ends. Some painters have shown a remarkable ability to bestow tactile values on visual images, to convey visually a sense of how objects feel. This is impressive. But so too is making bird noises while smoking cigars. And we must therefore ask whether the painter's skill serves any non-trivial end. Representation is part of the answer. The skill of the painter increases representative power, and especially before the days of photography, lots of purposes are served by the ability to represent, commemoration and decoration being among the most obvious. In general, we assume that the representative painting has a serious purpose, partly because it requires a skill that it is natural to admire. Why expend time and effort on the mastering of such a skill if not for a serious purpose? Though the challenge presented by the example of cigars and bird noises remains, but which of the many serious purposes representation can serve is distinctively artistic? And what is valuable about it? It is the task of a normative theory of art to answer this question. In the history of visual art, and the arts more widely perhaps, the importance of this question has only come to be recognized relatively recently. Throughout most of its development, painting has clearly had a social function. The decoration of churches, stately homes, and civic buildings, the painting of portraits, the recording of momentous events, and so on, that the question of any further raison d'etre for the visual arts has hardly arisen. As Gombrich says, in the good old days, no artist need ask himself why he had come into the world at all. In some ways, his work had been as well defined as that of any other calling. There were always altar paintings to be done, portraits to be painted. People wanted to buy pictures for their best parlors or commission murals for their villas. In all these jobs, he could work on more or less pre-established lines. He delivered the goods which the patron expected. True, he could produce indifferent work or do it so superlatively well that the job in hand was no more than an occasion for a transcendent masterpiece. But his position in life was more or less secure. It was just this feeling of security that artists lost in the 19th century. Gombrich identifies several historical causes, including the invention of photography, for the rift between the artist and the public. This rift brought into question the justification of painting as an occupation, and a similar question arose about sculpture. An appreciation of these historical developments is important for understanding the relation between the value of art and the forms of art prevalent at any one time. But the question we are concerned with here is not itself a historical one. It could be asked in any historical period why and to what extent skill at painting is to be valued. Charting historically the changing perceptions of the role of art may illuminate the answers we give. But one itself, it cannot supply them, because there may have been periods when this ability was overestimated or underestimated. Previous chapters concluded that art enhances the understanding of human experience. We may ask here, therefore, whether this is something the visual arts can do. One obvious way is through heightened experience of the visual itself. This suggestion may seem to make art superficial, literally, a reduction of painting to the level of mere colored patterns. This is a charge sometimes laid against modern art, especially so-called abstract art, that it has set aside centuries of achievement in the art of representation for the construction of mere pattern, and sometimes not even this. For example, the paintings of Mark Rothko, 1903 to 1970, which many art critics have regarded highly, are simply large patches of color. At the same time, presentation and exploration of the strictly visual has long been a quest in the history of art. Perhaps this quest has only come to full self-consciousness of late, but we should not conclude from this that it was ever wholly absent. Besides, whatever reservations we might have about modern art, there are good reasons to regard the exploration of the strictly visual as an achievement. In the preceding chapter, it was argued that music is a foregrounding of the aro, and that this is one of its valuable characteristics. Similarly, a special accomplishment of painting could be the foregrounding of the visual. We saw in the first part of this chapter that it is a mistake to think of representation as mere copying. Painters do not merely imitate. They cannot be thought of as presenting the raw visual data which the spectator then observes. Painters have to choose from all the things that can be seen. Often what they represent are hints and suggestions of what is seen. The mind of the spectator then supplies what is missing to form an image. This is how it is possible for painters such as Constable to use unnatural colors and yet give us a convincing impression that we are seeing the thing he has chosen to paint. In this way, prior knowledge enters our perception of a painting. This prior knowledge can also be a distortion of the visual. However, especially if it is the painter's knowledge as well as the spectators. This is what is happening in the Egyptian figures referred to at the beginning of this chapter. The painter knows what arms and legs and profiles look like from different angles, and then combines different perspectives in a single representation that does not resemble the normal thing at all. To appreciate the end result, we need to suspend our visual preconceptions. This is not an easy business. But once a move in this direction is made, we may find that true representational likeness recedes as well. Exponents of the school of art known as Impressionism were keenly aware of that fact, that we do not give most of the things we see close attention and only receive a fleeting impression of their appearance. They knew that bright light and deep shadow eliminate visual features, so they tried to capture something of this phenomenon in their paintings, one consequence of which was a loss of realism, as detailed features were suppressed. A particularly good example of this is Monet's Gare Saint-Lazare, in which the objects we would expect to find in a picture of a railway station are dominated and almost eliminated by the visual impact of sunlight, smoke, and steam. Gare Saint-Lazare can be understood as an attempt to strip the act of perception of all preconceptions and then thus encapsulate the purely visual. Foregrounding the visual is not incompatible with representational art, however. Whistler's famous painting entitled Arrangement in Gray and Black is a highly representational portrait of the artist's mother. The title reveals that we are invited to see the seated woman from a purely visual standpoint. This is why the work lacks a certain three-dimensional depth. So, if the prime purpose of a work of art is to foreground the visual and make abstract all preconception of how things are to be seen, then representational faithfulness is of secondary importance. A desire to heighten awareness of color or draw attention to incipient patterns, as in many of the paintings of Van Gogh, 1853 to 1890, and Paul Gauguin, 1848 to 1903, may call for representational freedom, only if, without reason, we insist upon the primacy of representation in art can these be called distortions. More than this, once we see that a painter can be concerned with experience and yet not primarily interested in the representation, we admit the possibility of paintings supplying us with wholly novel visual experience. This is what happens to some degree in Cubism and Surrealism. Picasso's well-known picture, Violin and Grapes, provides us with something we could not see without the artist's intervention, namely the different aspects of a violin from different angles and all at once. Many of Dali's paintings, whatever the theory behind them, exaggerate and hence draw attention to visual ambiguities. The shadow of a swan or the outline of an elephant, for instance, in Swans into Elephants. The Dali example introduces again some of the themes of chapter 4, where it was argued that we ought not to think of the relationship between art and reality as one of correspondence in which art reflects reality. Rather, art enhances our understanding by providing us with images and perspectives through which everyday experience may be seen afresh. This accords with the conclusions of this chapter that representation in the visual arts is not to be thought of as copying. The painter gets us to attend directly to our visual experience rather than seeing past it for the sake of the information it provides. Thus, Monet's painting of the Gare Saint Lazare is in one sense a picture of what is actually seen, but in another it is not, because normally our minds would supply details that are cloaked by the steam and the sunlight. Monet's achievement is to get us to focus on one aspect of our experience that is usually neglected. Dali's surrealist paintings, by contrast, can hardly be said to depict real experiences, yet the visual ambiguities in his pictures are merely exaggerations of real features of our visual experience. Dali creates an alternative experience rather than capturing the visual in our normal experience. And at the same time, his creations can be seen to be explorations of that experience. The same can be said for the engravings of M.C. Escher, many of which are now famous for just that reason. These explore perspective. The eye is drawn around, for instance, a waterfall. Each level seems lower than the one before, yet somehow, as the eye moves round, we reach the top of the waterfall again. These engravings are not merely technical puzzles. They show how the mind, and thus experience, may be manipulated in the perception of the visual. To construe the visual arts as a medium for the enhancement and exploration of visual experience does not trivialize it. It allows us to make sense of certain important developments in the history of contemporary painting. But if this were all that could be said for visual art as a form of understanding human experience, we would have failed to explain the importance of representation within an adequate theory of art. On the face of it, there is no special role for representation in the foregrounding of the visual. This means that as an explanation of the value of the visual arts, foregrounding skews our view of painting in the direction of modern developments. It gives little or no account of most of the great achievements of the past, which all had subjects. Additionally, though painting might in these ways reveal interesting aspects of our strictly visual experience, the strictly visual is a small item in our experience as a whole. If painting cannot move beyond the visual, it is inevitably of limited value and interest.